Bodie the Movie Maker here, and this is how to make a spooky cemetery environment in Unreal Engine. Today I'm going to show you how I made this overgrown cemetery environment that's right out of a horror film with free assets.
Help, please, I'm lost.
It utilizes Nanite and Lumen, and it was built in Unreal Engine 5.3. I made this environment for the animated short horror film based on my novel, Northport 1999, that I am making entirely in Unreal Engine. You might be wondering, is it a graveyard or is it a cemetery? Which one is it? What is the difference? Well, actually, a graveyard is just a piece of a property next to a building, literally a yard for a building such as a church where they keep graves, a graveyard. Whereas a cemetery is just a cool little place where dead people hang out. Let's start with the biggest components of this environment first and drill our way down to the smallest details. Starting with the landscape. First, I made a basic landscape material with two layers. One is a basic forest floor and the other is a forest path. I sculpted the landscape, gave it some hills here and there, and then I painted pathways. If I was going to do this environment over again, I would change the landscape material to one where I can enable displacement. Here's an example of tessellation. We've got two spheres next to each other, both with the same material, but one has displacement turned on and the other doesn't. And you can see how dramatically displacement affects this material. When we get this side view here, we can see how the texture extrudes and creates a lot more shadow play. This is a really effective way to bring in more detail into your scene. But you can imagine when you apply this to a landscape material, just having all that nice detail and shadows. Because a smooth looking flat landscape without enough detail is just gross. It's kind of a complex task getting a landscape material that you can enable displacement, so I'm not going to do it right now for this environment. So I used meshes to add more detail to the landscape, such as these really large ones like Icelandic volcano terrain. Let me lift that up and show you just how dramatic that is. And I just push it down so it's sticking out from the landscape just enough to provide more detail. Then we've also got the granite rock assembly hidden into the landscape a little bit. We've got Icelandic moss clusters, which are basically just these green boogers. Very useful for putting around the base of trees and such. And you can just keep repeatedly using them, and you can see how most of this mesh is hidden under the landscape. But you just bring it out just enough and it adds more detail. You just don't want large patches of untouched landscape material. Smooth lines don't really happen in nature. That's why you want to break up all your smooth landscape lines with meshes. So to really blend the landscape material, we bring in lots of big meshes like this, and we mix them with smaller ones like this Icelandic moss rocks. Much smaller, but when you blend that in with the landscape material, you really start to get a nice mixture of details. And then we've got the mossy embankment. We mix in some tree stumps like this. This is the granite rock assembly, which has got some rocks and some tree stumpage in there, and you angle it so you just have enough peeking out of your landscape to give it more detail. And then we've got this roots, forest roots. Put that in there, boom. The path is a spine mesh path. I found this path and all those meshes I just showed you in the Quixel Medieval Village project, which is free in the Unreal Engine marketplace. And all I did was I looked at the meshes they used and I picked and chose the ones I liked from their project and I migrated them over to mine. quick note, if you are migrating assets from one Unreal Engine project to another, I think it's best to make sure that those projects are the same version of Unreal Engine. I don't know if it's absolutely required, but I do know that when I tried to migrate assets from a Unreal Engine 5.3 project to an Unreal Engine 5.2 project, it didn't work. Now, for the skybox and lighting. Let's switch it to lit here. I've got my directional light set to like the sunset or sunrise colors. That way we get these nice amber hues in the clouds, very moody. But then I also put a giant sphere in the sky, and I put this moon sphere material from the Ithris temple project over it. Then I also have these giant planes in the sky in all directions and above with cloud cards from the Ithris temple project. From the Ithris cemetery project, excuse me. I don't believe that is free anymore. It was free last month in the free for the month Unreal Engine Marketplace assets. That's why it's important to grab them every month while you can. But there's only a few assets that I used from the Ithris cemetery, and you could easily find alternatives, and it will continue to be a completely free environment, so don't worry. But speaking of free monthly assets, I review the new free Unreal Engine assets every month, so make sure to subscribe if you want to keep abreast of all the coolest free stuff. You know you do. I recommend getting all the free assets you can get your hands on because you can learn so much by reverse engineering them, and you'll get new ideas for your projects. For the big moon sphere and the giant cloud planes, I just went in and changed the albedo tint, reduced the saturation a little bit, darkened it a little bit, so the clouds became a little bit more gray to fit the vibe I was going for.
Quick note, I ended up adding some more details, including some volumetric cloud assets. Really brings the vibe together, the mist clinging to the forest floor type of thing. However, I did pay for those volumetric cloud assets, but you can get alternatives for free or make them yourself.
You can see here, dotting the hillside, we've got structures like this mausoleum type building, and then these tombstones to make it a cemetery. The mausoleum and a bunch of these tombstone meshes were all from the Ithris cemetery, but then I also just used some stone squares that are kind of like stone steps from the medieval project, and these mausoleum buildings, I just reshaped them, squished them down, made them smaller, and turned them into tombstones. And then I slanted all of them, put them at an angle so they look more like a cemetery that's aged over time, and the ground has shifted and the graves have slanted. So I just put in a bunch of those and repeated them. Boom! You can easily just bring in like a shape mesh and turn it into a rectangle and put some stone material on there, and that's gonna look like a tombstone, a headstone. Okay, moving right along. Now let's talk about the trees and foliage. So you can see I did some foliage painting of all the big trees and medium-sized trees for the entire environment. So I use the Megascan's trees assets, black alder. Those are great. And I changed the leaf color to a more sort of autumn, and kind of I turned it to unhealthy, and I gave it some subtle wind. So then you'll see I brought in a lot of these skeletal trees, which are also Quixel Megascan assets. These nice skeletal trees really fit the cemetery vibe, so you'll see that in my entire environment, most of the skeletal trees are all present in the cemetery. Then for smaller foliage, I used grasses and small tree saplings and ferns. One quick note, I only have the wind turned on for the large trees. I want to figure out how to get the wind in the smaller foliage. That really brings more life and motion. I recommend you do that as well. Finally, I painted the landscape with lots of other foliage, sort of ground scatter, like these pieces of bark and little rocks and stuff and little branches that you can see here. Those really help break up the environment. Now for some of the last touches that bring extra life and movement to the environment, I added Niagara particles, all of which I first saw in the medieval project and I thought it looked amazing, and so I just migrated them over to mine. So you can see here, I've got this Niagara wind effect, which just basically is like some small dust particles that fly through the air, and that really just is a very subtle touch. But then there's also Niagara particles of falling leaves, which are much more noticeable. So those mixed together are great, especially for, you know, every cemetery. It's either going to be raining, it's going to be winter, or it better be, you know, autumn, fall, falling leaves, autumn color, perfect. And then finally, the smallest Niagara particle that I added that I love is these flies, which they're meant to be put over like dung, but I thought they looked perfect as moths next to these lights in my environment. What do you think? Do you think that's a cool touch? Let's talk about the final touch, the post-process volume. So I did some bloom, turned up the intensity, we got the exposures manual, of course, chromatic aberration, I turned that up a bit so we get a bit of color fringing around the edges. Lens flares, I turned those on. For the color grading, I just adjusted the global saturation. I desaturated it and brought it a little bit to the blue. I like the way this makes the reds in the sky and the yellows in the hazmat suits look. Global illumination method set to lumen. Film grain, I turned that on, turned up the intensity, and I used a film grain material again from the Quixel Medieval Village project. So always check out free assets. You never know what you might want to take for your next project. I also added some motion blur and sharpening and vignetting. You're going to want to play around with post-processing volume settings to your liking to match your project, but I really think it helped me hone in on the vibe of my horror film. But there we are. Oh man, I love it. I'm super excited about this. I think this cemetery is a great backdrop for the scene that we're gonna have here. Can't wait to share more about this project with you guys. And there it is, with all of our ingredients put together, we've made one tasty dish that is the spooky cemetery environment. Tell me what you think in the comments. What would you improve? What would you do differently? Do you know how to enable wind in the smaller foliage? Let me know. If you enjoyed this, please hit the like, hit the subscribe, and hit the bell. Okay, love ya, bye.
And if you'd like to support my work, check out patreon.com/Bodie the Movie Maker, where you'll get access to the short films, the novels. It'll get you credited in the back of the book when they are published to the public. It gets you access to the private community, a 15% off discount on merch. There's hundreds of posts, including many illustrations by myself and the professional illustrator Gus Trouth. It's just $5 a month with no commitment. Plus, you'll get shoutouts at the end of videos like this. There is a free version of the Patreon, and we'll even throw in a 5% merch discount for free Patreon members.